When we read Old Testament stories, there is often significance in the meanings of names that we find there. And the first chapter of Ruth is no exception. So we find Naomi, whose name means pleasant. But by the end of the chapter, she's asking to be called Mara, which means bitter, reflecting the journey that she's been on. And then there's Mahlon and Chilion, whose names mean respectively something like sickness and destruction. And so, again, at the beginning of the story, we're given an indication as to what their fate is going to be. But today we're encouraged to think about Orpah, Naomi's daughter-in-law, along with Ruth. And the name Orpah probably derives from a word meaning the nape of the neck, the back of the neck. And it's a picture of that moment when, as a three, they've come out of Moab on the way back to Bethlehem. And Naomi urges her daughters-in-law, go back to Moab, go back to your families. And Orpah is obedient to that urging. And so the picture is of the back of her neck disappearing into the distance. She is faceless. And I don't think that's an unimportant detail, particularly when you add into it that she and Ruth are from Moab. Now, Moab was a neighbouring country to Israel, and like most of the neighbouring countries of Israel, the Israelites despised them. They looked down on them. And their tradition had it that the origin of the Moabites lay in an incestuous relationship that Lot had had with his daughter. In other words, this was a people that were closely related to the Israelites, but to be seen as greatly inferior to them in God's eyes. We have this faceless person, this person who comes from a country that the Israelites looked down upon. And it probably should come as no surprise that as later people fleshed out the story, tried to add the minimal detail that is in the story. And of course, in the minimum detail, we see Orpah being loyal to Naomi and her family, even to the point of following Naomi's instructions as they return to Bethlehem, the instruction to go back home. But that didn't stop later writers, the Jewish rabbis, adding to the story in a very inglorious way. So, for example, they write that on the night that she returned, Orpah slept with 100 men and a dog. It's really not the kind of detail that you want to go looking for. But this can happen when someone is stripped of all personality, when you have no real relationship with them, when they are simply faceless. It's not very different to the modern day internet troll who communicates but feels that they can get away with saying or doing just about anything to the person that they are trolling because they have no personal relationship with them. Every life is important to God. We began this service with a song that said, I can see your heart, God's heart, 8 billion different ways. Every precious one, a child you died to save. And Jesus said, are not 5 sparrows sold for a penny? They are virtually valueless. And yet God remembers every single one of them. And Jesus said, if God is like that, if God cares for the sparrow, then how much more will he care for you? Every hair on your head, and if it's like my hairs, it's a pretty rapid in and out, but every hair on your head, Jesus said, is numbered and known by God. And God cares for all people in the world, but he calls us to care too. Jesus said we're to be light for the world. We're to be salt, bringing flavour to the world. God puts the Holy Spirit in us in order that he might be able to love through us. Yet this body that the Holy Spirit is in is a fragile vessel, as we say. We are only imperfect human beings. And so often we lose sight of the pain and suffering of other people. Why do we do that? Sometimes because we're in blissful ignorance of things going on around the world. Because these things just don't get onto the agendas of the people that put together our news for us. Or it can be that things happening on the other side of the world, a long, long way away, just don't really seem real to us. Or it could be that we learn as a defence mechanism to switch off for our own good, what we politely call compassion fatigue. But God calls us to care for, or not to switch off from the pain and the suffering of the world. And it has to be said, there is a lot of misery reflected in this opening chapter of Ruth. So much we skim through because, and again, in a way, the people just become faceless. But we skim through them because there's a happy ending at the end, or what we think is a happy ending. But what do we have? We have famine to start with. And when something is called a famine, usually people are dying of hunger. We have premature death. We have Elimelech, we have Mahlon and Chilion dying before their time. We have, and we can easily skim over this, barrenness. We're told that Ruth and Orpah were both married for 10 years, and yet without children. And we should be aware of the stigma and often the guilt that goes with childlessness. And then there are people moving between countries, refugees on the road, moving from culture to culture. But there are also things within the story that you probably don't notice. And so, for example, when Mahlon and Chilion marry Ruth and Orpah, the NRSV says took them, which might be closer to the truth, because the word that is used there isn't the conventional word for marriage, but is a word that is used once or twice in the Old Testament to talk about bride kidnapping, to talk about people being abducted to be married. The strong inference is that Ruth and Orpah were literally taken to be married. And I have to say, to my shame, I was blissfully unaware that bride kidnapping is a huge problem in the world today, something I've discovered through preparing for this service. And then there's that, well, we might call it a lovely speech of Ruth, where she pledges her commitment to Naomi, and taken one way, taken as an expression of loyalty between two women, that's absolutely so, and it's been rightly repeated through the ages. But go and have another look at those words. They're spoken unilaterally from Ruth to Naomi. Naomi does not say them back to Ruth. And in an age where everything depended upon men, where one woman, two women, three women on their own were very vulnerable, and vulnerable economically as well. When we know nothing about Ruth's family background, but she may well have had no home to go back to. And having been married to an Israelite for 10 years without any children, it's doubtful who might have wanted to marry her anyway. And it's just the circumstances out of which something we call bond or economic slavery comes from, where someone is so desperate that they tie themselves to someone else as a virtual servant or slave. Look at those words again. And if it's not indicative of that kind of desperation, it certainly points us to the fact that that is so rife in our world today. As we come face to face with all of this misery and suffering, it's very easy to get bogged down, but we need to remember the God who is over everything. We see that at the beginning of the chapter with the name Elimelech, which means my God is king. But also at the end of the chapter as well. As Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. And of course, as Christians, we see Bethlehem in a completely different light. We see Bethlehem as the place where Jesus is born. Jesus, who did so much to give us the view that we have of God, and that God is our King, but also a King who loves and cares for all his people.